radiothermal generators a call to arms. And the reason we're calling people to arms is because of the significant threat to space exploration, particularly unmanned deep space exploration, posed by assaults on the use of radiothermal generators as a power source in spacecraft. I'm Glen Reynolds, and with me I have Kyger and Friedman of the Planetary Society. Thank you. For those of you who aren't familiar with the background, radiothermal generators, which are not nuclear reactors, rely on the natural decay of radioactive isotopes, typically plutonium, to generate heat, which is converted by a thermocouple into electricity. They're very useful for deep space power under circumstances where solar cells are not a viable option for cost reasons or for performance reasons. The first real flap over the use of RTGs in space came last fall regarding the launch of the Galileo space probe. Galileo, of course, is powered by RTGs, and a group known as the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice, in coalition as well with Jeremy Rifkin and with the Christian Institute, a public interest law group that has provided legal representation, came in at the last minute before the launch and attempted to get a temporary restraining order barring the launch of Galileo. This failed, and for a while it looked as if the issue was moot. But the Christian Institute has amended its complaint and is now seeking an injunction against all launches of spacecraft containing radiothermal generators. This will come up next in the context of the Ulysses launch, which is scheduled for October of next year, which also contains radiothermal generators, and there's likely to be litigation before that time. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what NSS has done in this context. We have filed comments in support of the launch with NASA as part of the environmental impact statement process. We are exploring other possibilities, such as participating in the litigation as an amicus curiae, that is a friend of the court, and possibly taking other actions, such as staging counter demonstrations should the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice or other groups protest the launch. Before I do that, I'm going to turn things over to Friedman of the Planetary Society, who has a meeting upstairs he has to get to, and let him present his part of the talk first.
Well, I don't have a whole lot to say. I'm going to leave a number of handouts here which explain both the issue and some of the response to the issue. Included in that is an article that we did anticipating this whole issue a couple of years ago. We did an article in the Planetary Report sometime, I think it was around early 1988, and on radiation risk in planetary exploration, RTG controversy. Additionally, I have a copy of a statement by Dr. Sagan on the Galileo mission and a extensive publication of that statement in USA Today, which was timed just before the Galileo issue was being resolved in the executive branch. And then also an exchange of letters with the same Freeze organization, which is inquired of Dr. Sagan of the Planetary Society what our position might be in the future. I think there are a couple of key points I just want to mention. One is sort of a question which we have to get clear in our own mind, which is anyone who is concerned about radiation, danger of radioactive power sources in space crazy? And I think the answer, certainly we have to conclude, is no. Radioactive power in space, as well as on Earth, is a legitimate concern. There are legitimate concerns. The issue, like every other issue in this regard, is one of risk, one of safety, and one of value. What is the value versus what is the risk? The risk could be unacceptably large, no matter what the value. The risk could be minimal, but the value minimal. The risk could be very small, the value very large, all other combinations therein. These are evaluations that have to be made. They're serious questions. And it would be wrong, I think, for those of us who are advocates space exploration to assume that just because it's going to space it's good, and therefore people ought to accept it blindly. And certainly some of the questioning about the radiation danger from the RTGs on space launch are reasonable and must be dealt with reasonably. The question of alternatives is also important. If the risk is small but could be made less by alternatives, that would be something that we certainly want to explore and explore carefully. One of the key elements of the battle against Galileo was not that the risk was not only that they thought the risk was high, but even if they were willing to concede that the risk wasn't so high, that there were alternatives that could be put into place. And they had made and are still making a point, which is why hasn't NASA done a better job in coming up with alternatives to nuclear power on these missions. The answer, I think, the justifiable answer, which is that the alternatives don't exist now. To get them to exist in a reasonable time frame with enormous costs that have to be borne by the citizens who pay for these missions, or by the effective cancellation of the benefits of the mission. I think that's an answer that can be defended, but the question of alternatives is a reasonable one. That question works both ways, because if any one mission could get away without nuclear power, for example, let's just say that Galileo didn't have to be launched last year. We could wait a couple of years and put a solar power array that was a little larger using some advanced technology. Couldn't we have just waited and accepted that cost as being acceptable? I think the answer might be yes, except that it is not just one, it's not just an alternative for Galileo that's at stake. It is the question of how are we going to solve this problem in the future? I think there's even a realization that on Earth, it's not any one reactor, because we would certainly close that reactor if we had any question about it. It's the question that a lot of people feel that we have to solve the problem of reactor safety on Earth in general, because this problem won't go away, the problem of energy won't go away, and that nuclear energy is still an important source of the future, and we ought to spend some money on trying to make it safe and reliable. Similarly, in space, those of us who look at planetary exploration can't imagine working on the surface of Mars or the surface of any planet for very long without nuclear power sources. We can't imagine going to the outer planets in the 21st century without nuclear power sources. So it's not just a question of the very next mission, can an alternative be found for it, but the question of is it worth trying to look at the more general problem of alternatives. We have found, in general, that it's a great issue. That this whole issue was brought up is, I think, a positive sign that people are expressing awareness. Our role as an education group, most people here belong to one of the educational groups about space exploration. It's a wonderful opportunity to educate. That the reaction to it has been pretty good. It's a very minor protest. Didn't get very far. Got turned down without any serious consideration of each significant step they took. Didn't engender much public enthusiasm, and therefore it was a reasonable debate about a reasonable subject, and responded to in about a reasonable way. So I don't foresee this as a major issue or a major change. Obviously, if an accident occurred, that would change things. It could be an accident totally unrelated to the space program. It could change things too. So there's always wild cards in this. But in general, I think that this is an issue which needs education, needs discussion, needs informed reasoning about, and needs careful consideration. Sometimes that has to be done on the part of the groups who are promoting the protest, and in that case, I think some of what we'll hear has been done. In sometimes it has to be done on the part of NASA and the advocates of the missions. Sometimes that needs encouragement, because there was for example, in the initial NASA response, there was a ludicrous statement made that there was no risk. That's the kind of statements that get you into a lot of trouble because they have no credibility, and they bring you into the specter of people not trusting the government, as you know has occurred with the Department of Energy over their handling of nuclear power safety issues. So there's an enormous credibility issue here in the eyes of the public, much larger, I think, than the actual issue itself. So if there's any sort of preaching here that I would do on this issue, it is to remain credible at all times.
True words were never spoken. Thanks a lot, Lou. And I'll turn it over now to Tim, who has had the experience of debating, I believe it was Lanny Sinkin, from the Christian Institute on Cable News Network. And I'm not sure he would characterize the debate as one that has been a reasonable debate with reasonable people at all times. I missed that broadcast, but I heard that it was very memorable.
Well, in fact, if you missed a broadcast, I brought the tape, and it's off in the Huckster room at the SSI and Joint SSI Space Frontier Foundation table. I work for Congressman Dana Rohrabacher as legislative aide, but I'm not here representing him. I got to take that hat off, put another hat on, and that is the hat of the Space Frontier Foundation. I did debate. I was the only one to do that. And I'd like to say that I was, frankly, I'm very happy that the Planetary Society and Dr. Sagan did, and the National Space Society, furthermore, has done and did in that debate, in that time frame, what they did to counter the claims of these individuals. But I frankly think that Dr. Sagan and yourself, Dr. Friedman, could have done more. Sagan's got access to Nightline, to Carson, and so forth. And I frankly think he should have gone on and made his point there. Not as many people read USA Today as see Carson. So, I would criticize, but frankly, it's criticism only of degree, not of time. And I would like to thank you guys for doing what you did do, because that puts you on the side of the angels, in my opinion. I was on CNN, and I think maybe 5 people in the U.S. saw the show. One of them taped it for me. So, I wouldn't characterize it as a result of my dealing of that one meeting as a reasonable debate. I felt I was the only person there who was arguing fact as opposed to emotion. And in fact, I think this is the problem here that we face in this whole issue, is that the problem that is being discussed is not being debated on the merits of fact and rational debate. It is I think that on the side of the Christics and on the side of the Florida Coalition of Peace and Justice, that the direction they are approaching this problem from is their minds are made up already, and they are going after it in an emotional fashion. Well, so be it. If that's the case, I plan to ask to debate emotionally in that case, because you cannot win an emotional argument with rationalism, I feel, not in 15-second sound bites anyway. And if that's the case, so be it. We'll fight emotion with emotion. I'd like to do that right now a little bit. The name of this panel was RTG's, a call to arms, question mark. And my answer to that question is, yes, a call to arms, goddammit. Let's talk briefly then, and I'm sorry there are not more people here to do this. The issue is not environmentalism. The people, for example, who are filing on the draft environmental impact statement are the following: Federation of American Scientists, Southern California Federation of Scientists, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice, the Air Force, presumably they're kind of critical, Committee for Risk Analysis and Regulation, and the Committee to Bridge the Gap. Do you hear an environmental organization in that group? Now, they're perfectly free to do that, but for these peace groups or anti-war, anti-nuke groups to characterize themselves as environmentalists, I think is a misnomer. I don't see the Sierra Club here. I don't see the Wilderness Foundation, Wilderness Federation, National Wildlife Federation, sorry, among them. And part of the reason is that at least on that side of the house, in the environmental movement, They're rational people who are able to respond to rational argument as opposed to just emotional. Now, I'm painting myself with the same brush, frankly, right now by sitting here and flaming, and I'll cop to that. But this is something that I think needs to be countered. The only thing that needs to be done in order to win this fight is for people to speak up when these groups appear on TV, on radio, in print, and try to say, no, that's not exactly the case as I understand it, and lay the facts out. So I guess in that case, I am endorsing Dr. Friedman, what you just said. But do it forcefully, because that's the only way you're going to get people in the audience to listen. The handout you got, I'll speak to this and then I'll turn it back to Glenn here, is a letter. I apologize, it's a copy of the facts of the facts. But this is what the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice mailed to several environmental groups, trying to solicit those environmental groups in this particular action. So there's been some speculation that there will be no fight over Ulysses and over the Ulysses launch, and I can promise you there will be tons of fight over the Ulysses launch because this is a perfect media opportunity for these people. They're going to try to get other allies, just as we would in the same situation. This is the game of politics. We need to play the game of politics, therefore to get what we want, which are planetary missions that can be flown. Some of these missions require power sources such as RTGs and can't be otherwise accomplished. If that's what we believe in, and that's what we want, then that's what we need to fight for.
That's yours. I'd like to correct one false impression I may have given if I suggested in any way that Tim is the only one to debate Lanny Sinkin. I should point out that Luke Friedman also debated Lanny Sinkin on CNN. The forces of righteousness in this battle were double the size that some of you may have thought based on what I had said there.
And actually, and I don't mean to do, if I could just interrupt, but Jeff List was prepared to go in my place also. In fact, so let's give Jeff a round of applause also. Let me interrupt the conversation.
Thanks for sparing me. You don't have to be down in the mud pile with that.
Well, it's funny you characterize it that way, but what I'd like to do is follow up now. If you'll indulge me for just a moment, I'm going to give you about a 90-second law lesson and drop into my professional mode for a second to explain what's going on in this process and what the fight is really over, because you could read the press accounts for days and not figure out what people were really fighting about in this. And then I'll talk about how NSS responded, or more often didn't really respond in the Galileo context. Some of the things we're looking at as potential responses in the context of Ulysses, and then I'd like to open it up and hear some opinions and suggestions from people in the room. The way these things get fought out is under two separate provisions of environmental law. The most important of which is what's called NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA requires the preparation of an environmental impact statement. The statement has to lay out the environmental benefits and costs of a particular action. And the way people challenge a decision made under NEPA is by challenging the environmental impact statement, by arguing that it doesn't take the risks properly into account, by arguing that it overlooks important factors, by arguing that it was prepared improperly in a way that didn't take various other views into account, and so on. The reason they have to attack it this way is that NEPA, and indeed hardly any environmental law, doesn't forbid something on the grounds that it is too risky. It merely is designed to try and require that the agency in question take all the risks into account in making its decision and weigh them against the benefits. And as a result, that's what's actually at stake when these things are challenged. And one of the things we try to do in the context of Ulysses is make sure that NASA does a better job with its environmental impact statement on both the cost and the benefit side. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. In Galileo, there was a lot of concern within the organization, and much of it justified, that we might turn a minor issue.
The organization being the NSS.
All right, I'm sorry. That we might turn a minor issue that would get relatively little media play into a bigger one by entering into the fray. Many people felt that the people opposing the launch were obviously crazies, and that we would give them an air of legitimacy by opposing them. The problem was, as it turned out, that regardless of what you think about their obvious craziness, they got a lot of media attention, and they got one-sided media attention. They were able to frame the issue in a way that was sufficient to raise concerns in many intelligent people over issues that, in fact, didn't exist. Risk of nuclear explosion on launch, for example. And
let me interrupt just briefly. I think the reason they got the one-sided attention was not because the media was one-sided about it per se, but because they could get nobody to speak against them. As a general statement, obviously a few people did, but as a general rule, they couldn't find anybody.
That's right. This is what's known in the few remaining communist circles here as revolutionary self-criticism, and with the goal here that we will do better next time. In my previous life, I worked under Joe Califano, who now practices law in Washington, and his theory of public relations on controversial issues is what he calls the inoculation theory. His theory is if you get your side of the story out first, then people already have a mental image of what you're doing when somebody else attacks you, and they're inoculated against the propaganda that they receive later. I think, in retrospect, we would have been better off had we done that, had we gotten out front on this issue, rather than being in a reactive and a rather slow reactive mode. That's what we hope to do in the context of Ulysses. Ulysses is likely to be a lot bigger fight, and to give you a few more seconds of that law lesson, I'll explain in part why. The people challenging the Galileo launch came in very, very late, just before the launch, and they filed a motion for a temporary restraining order. Now, a temporary restraining order is the hardest thing to get from a court, just about in law, because you come in at the last minute, admittedly at the last minute, and you ask the court to do something without having time to consider all the issues. So you have to show likelihood of irreparable harm, you have to show that you have such a strong case, you would almost certainly win if it went to trial, and so on. It's a very difficult hurdle to overcome. It was particularly hard here because if the launch window was missed, the launch was going to be delayed for a period of several years. As a result, the court threw them out with a short opinion that basically said, you idiots, come back next time and do it right. The problem is, this is next time, and as near as we can tell, they're trying to do it right. They're raising a minimum of $50,000 for legal fees, and they are planning to bring the issue to trial in time to get the launch enjoined. And there are two ways of responding to that, in a legal sense, that is. The first is to make sure the environmental impact statement is good, and we try to do that. The NSS has filed comments supporting the launch with NASA as part of the process of putting together the environmental impact statement. And those comments, I have a copy here if anybody would like to look at them. Those comments did two things. First, they generally endorsed NASA's assessment that the risk was largely minimal, though not non-existent. The second thing that they did was they criticized the environmental impact statement for not taking adequate account of the environmental benefits of the Ulysses mission in terms of things like greater understanding of solar climate, solar variability, and its impact on Earth's climate, and the greenhouse effect, global warming, and all of that sort of stuff. And pointed out also the significant demoralization costs on the planetary science community if this launch was going to be blocked at the last minute after over a decade of work for environmental reasons, and the broader impact that would have on efforts to learn more about the Earth and space and the environment. That was our big tack. Should their litigation arise, as it probably will, NSS may well participate as a friend of the court, an amicus curiae, as lawyers call it, and raise these kind of arguments again in the hopes of influencing the court.
Can you say a little bit about what that means? What is an amicus curiae?
An amicus curiae isn't a party. That is, you're not bound by the judgment, you're neither a plaintiff nor a defendant, but you are entitled to present your views, assuming the court lets you file in that capacity, you have a right to file, basically to assist the court in reaching its decision, and that often comes up in environmental cases and other cases with a strong public interest component. There's no guarantee, of course, that a court will let you file a brief as an amicus curiae, but it would be very unusual for it not to permit filing in this context. And the other advantage you get here is the people opposing the launch are wearing the mantle of being the public interest lawyers. When we have people who call themselves public interest, and are public interest groups in our case certainly, on both sides of the issue, it changes the whole cast of the case and the way the court views it. and is indeed likely, I think, to make the court more willing to defer to the decision of the agency involved and their expertise. Does that answer your question? There are other things we could do, and I'm interested in hearing what people think. We could be more aggressive. It's likely they'll pick it to launch. We could counter demonstrate. We could pick it their headquarters. We could do other things. We have already decided to put together a speakers bureau and have people who will be on call from the media and ready to appear fully briefed, sounding intelligent, and mentioning the NSS prominently in their sound bites when the issue comes up again in the fall. That, I think, is the least we can do. And Tim, as you might guess, is strongly in favor of being more aggressive. You want to say about that?
Big surprise to all of you, I'm sure. No, and here's the logic I have. These guys are taking over and above the issue of right versus wrong. Let's set that aside. We do that a lot in Congress. The fact is that these guys are going to get tons and tons of press. Why? Because they did, and they're very good at that. This is also the major reason they're doing what they're doing. They probably can't stop the launch. If they do that, that's great. But what they can do is get on the air like crazy and raise money because of the publicity they get, which is the whole race on debt of the operation. We can use, so to speak, political jujitsu. They're getting on the air. The TV stations and the print media and so forth want to be able to look balanced and fair. They're looking for people to oppose them. Furthermore, it makes good TV, good theater to have groups in opposition. So in other words, we let them go pay for our media.
How does it sound?
Great.
I think you also have to realize these groups, you see, they're really in their own benefit, an economic motive, the same motive as the people. But this is a skirmish, or a really critical battle in coming up with a very power sale established. The same people will do the same job when we try to start the power satellite. Larry Henry Simkin is an anti-nuclear activist. I'm very embarrassed to say awesome Texas on my account. He helped, he tried to stop, failed to stop nuclear. And he went to Washington looking for your game. And we've got to put a very large effort into this project. They'll do this Facebook.
Word that only the United States does it. I don't see these guys complaining about those dirty, radioactive, dirty topaz reactors that the Soviets are flying that seem to, in their Rorsats, that seem, that have impacted twice and severely irradiated things. There is an underlying issue here which isn't getting discussed, and that's the purpose, the underlying purpose for these groups. And that purpose is to advance the quote-unquote peace agenda, which is to say anti-nuclear activities and Luddism.
Right.
Now, let's not hide that. That's the truth, in my opinion. We can't say that.
It's an awfully dirty word.
And
the correct word.
It is the correct word. In the case of one of the proponents of this action, Jeremy Rifkin, he has said, I am a Luddite, and I am proud of it.
But is Bruce Gagnon a Luddite?
I don't know. I can't answer that. But I would assume that if one of the groups and one of the major proponents actually uses the label and revels in it, that therefore that's guilt by association. That may not be fair, but my observation of their position is that it is a Luddite position.
By its fruit, the tree is known.
One of the problems is by posing something to the legal system, they can, for a few $1,000s and some volunteer time, can present problems which cost hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right.
And costs, so they've got real leverage for their money.
Well, as you say, they get a lot of leverage for their money through the legal system, but the advantage is we get a lot of leverage for even less money out of getting involved in the legal system as well. Now, part of what we're doing is limiting damage, because they will generate a certain amount of bad publicity that we can't counter, even if we generate good publicity on our own. They will slow things down, perhaps, by litigating. But the advantage we have is courts are fairly deferential when it comes to agency expertise and technical questions, particularly here where you've got a launch window where if they miss it, the delay mounts up into many more years. So that's going to limit their ability to simply slow things down. Of course, they could win, and if they win, then they will have done a lot of damage.
But if my formulation, I think this should be clear in our minds, is that the likelihood of their actually winning in court is very, very small. That's not the fight that's being fought. It's a public relations battle. If they win, it's great. They say, wow, yeah. What's really going on is public relations, and you know, again, this is image, his positioning, and so forth. That's a fight we can win simply by being there. Here's an example. NSS was asked to be on Nightline. I understand that some people at NSS headquarters are not, will not support that statement, and maybe I'm incorrect in the details, but in broad general, and I don't know specifics, but generally the intent was there on the part of the Nightline producers to try to get somebody. They eventually had Gene Cernan on, which they pulled out. They were not thrilled with having Gene because he was from ABC. They wanted to get somebody who was independent to oppose and debate Jeremy Rifkin. We had probably, NSS probably had an opportunity therefore to be on Nightline.
We did. Actually, I was the person who was called by a booker for Nightline, who I know personally, and I was unable to say yes because I was unwilling to go on without the NSS sanction, which was not available. And I want to say,
let me underline that. NSS sanction was not available. In fact, this NSS position at headquarters, and again, I don't want to get into the details of who or why because it's immaterial, but it was a let's not go on or get involved. That position seems to be changing and is changing, I think, and I'd like to applaud that and try to encourage
I
that.
disagree very strongly and very vocally with that decision, and not just because I would have liked to have been on Nightline, but I also want to stress that while I think that decision was wrong, it was not stupid. That there are many times when that kind of decision is the correct decision to make, but I don't think under these circumstances it was, and I think that we've learned from the experience. Again, as I say, we have revolutionary self-criticism here, and I think that we'll do it better next time, and I think that's important because I think next time is the time that really matters.
Well, and I agree with that to about 99%, but and here's the 1% disagreement. Yeah, I know, and here's the 1% disagreement because I think the decision was ultimately very stupid for the following reason. Anytime you get on Nightline, even if you get skunked in the debate, you've just been had more advertising exposure than NSS has ever had in its entire existence. Even if you get thoroughly blasted into the ground by the opposite person on the debate.
Two things. Number one, I assume that no suit has been filed yet as far as Ulysses.
Well, the suit has already been
It has
filed.
already been filed. Okay.
If you want to know the actual posture, Justice moved for it to be dismissed after Galileo was launched on the grounds that it was moved, and the complaint was amended to encompass all future launches of spacecraft
Okay.
containing RTGs.
Okay, the second comment, is there any reverse preemptive action being prepared, say to go to the 20 most prestigious environmental groups in advance, have them signed up saying nothing wrong with this so that that can be ready as part of a press kit?
We have actually quietly, I believe, headquarters has quietly spoken to the leading environmental groups in Washington, given them copies of the comment that we filed on the EIS, and suggested to them that they're not really helping the environmental cause and in fact are hurting it if they come in against Ulysses. And you can see by the list of people who have filed that it has worked.
Now, my point is that doesn't really go far enough. I mean, I would like to be able to have in my hot little hands when Ulysses goes off a list saying here are the 20 leading environmental groups. They have signed a statement saying there's absolutely nothing pro-environment about this protest and that these RTGs should go off in Ulysses. Any possibility of getting that?
I think the possibility of getting that is extremely slim. I think it would be wonderful if we could, but while they may not endorse this movement, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Number one, it is our fault, our fight. They don't gain very much. And number two, if you're at the Sierra
Well, they do
Club,
gain a
you
lot
have your
by
own
not
members
having-
to deal with, and coming out against an anti-nuclear group, even when they're wrong, is a politically difficult and risky thing to do. It's not worth it when there's no payoff.
Don't they have a payoff in the sense of not having their movement co-opted by these fringe
Their
groups?
movement and the other movement are very interpenetrated. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That is just the reality of the situation. Is that that in the same way that, for example, probably the Planetary Society membership and MSS membership are probably very, for want of a better phrase, interpenetrated. That's a horrible word.
Making our counterattack in another direction, who would have standing to file a countersuit for, what's the legal phrase, malicious persecution? Yeah.
NASA would, but although I don't know how good a claim they have, but they won't do it.
I mean, NASA won't even criticize its own internal design.
And politically, it's risky and difficult and ultimately unsuccessful to sue people for suing you when you're the government. So NASA really wouldn't be wrong to do that. And you don't want the government filing suits against people who sue it as a general rule, because you want people to be able to sue the government when it's wrong. You want the courts to be able to decide whether it's right or not.
Couple comments, actually, if I could break in.
You got the microphone.
Yeah,
That's wrong, Ray said I paid for this microphone.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, a couple things, if I could just get in edgewise, I'm sorry. Before I forget, because I didn't get a chance in the meeting before this one. This is something, I don't get an opportunity to do this very often, but we need to thank the committee. I mean, this is kind of out of left field, but if you know anybody on the committee staff who helped put this conference together, go up and give them a hug and thank them. They worked their butts off. I ran two of these before. It's a thankless job, and that's the only payback they get. They're not doing it for any money. Give them a hug if they're a woman or they're a man, whatever. Your choice. Yeah, they're usually one or the other.
That's California, what the?
Yeah.
We had a few hands up on the front row, and I'm just going to go left to right because I forget who was first.
Okay, I think one thing, it's like what Luke Friedman said about we're going to need nuclear power units for like to be on Mars or the moon or anywhere, at least for the initial phases. I mean, it's like I was just in the NASA conference, and they're talking about, say, 1999 before they really know if it is or not. And if you're going to build a vehicle to support the space station, you're probably talking 2010. Okay. Now we're talking about going to Mars. The thing is, from information that I've seen, we could build a NERPA-powered spacecraft that could be launched, strapped onto the shuttle external tank, launched into orbit, and then the engine could be activated, go to Mars, land, refuel on Mars, come back. We could build this thing in less than 8 years and build it for, say, $150 billion. And instead of taking 30 years and spending $1 trillion to go to Mars, the main crux really boils down, are we going to use nuclear power to advance ourselves in space, or aren't we?
No.
Well, I think the answer to that is probably no. And what you're describing is basically the 1969 Agnew Commission Mars mission outline. And it's a swell Mars mission outline. I sure wish we'd done it, because I think it called for a landing on Mars in 1981.
Yeah.
And think about that now. Doesn't that just break your heart? But
Even under the
Well,
long
the thing is,
term.
this vehicle can support the initial moon missions too, because it has that capability also.
Well, see, you're being reasonable.
Well, I realize that.
I think they're
This is
It
politics.
basically boils down to a battle of either learning to use nuclear power. I mean, as an example, if we build 4 NAST or NAST-derived aircraft, they're of no use because they're going to be so damn expensive that you're going to have what they call the Russell-Still-Scan effect, where you took gold into orbit, took straw into orbit and converted it to gold, it wouldn't be economically feasible. I mean, as an example, if you took fuel rods into Earth orbit, refined them, used a mass drive or a rail gun to fire them away from the Earth, and brought the material back to reuse it, where you needed, say, 100 NAST-derived aircraft, where you cost the cost of a 747 or something, you have something practical. But the thing is you got to say, yes, we're going to use nuclear power, and get on with it.
I think
Otherwise, we're just dragging our feet.
right now, in the current political climate, there's no way you could get something through Congress, I think, that would call for the use of nuclear power. That may change. That may change. The first step in changing that is to win the RTG battle.
Well, I want to say this is a derivative of this battle, and we need to have some kind of long-term strategy instead of just worrying about RTGs themselves.
I but in other words, we're going to have to do two things. In other words, a two-pronged attack, very tactically oriented, short-term right now. Why? Because we don't have, because we're not.
Well, I'm saying,
We're
we're
losing
going to
some-
develop an educational program of some kind.
Well, that's the other
To go
problem.
with this.
That's that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
You and I.
Tim, can you just give a couple of your emotional counter arguments you were talking about, maybe things like you used on well,
Well, the thing, I'm not so sure you want to be emotional so much as emotive. In other words, you want, for example, this guy, Larry Sinkin, and you can see the videotape. Oh, God, please see it. The first thing he said was, he was asked by the moderator, a woman named Friedman on CNN, the Sonia White show, geez, what about this plutonium stuff? And Sinkin said, well, plutonium, was named after the god of hell, and it was named after the god of hell, Pluto, because it's such a hellish metal. Well, that's bullshit. That was, and that was my reaction. Come on, get real. It was named Pluto because it was the element after Neptunium. There, uranium, Neptunium, plutonium, because they were naming them after the outer planets in order. And this, I went on. I said, this is an example of what these guys do. They're magicians. Magicians specialize in not lying, but in misdirection. And while their hands are over here, their argument is over here. So that's a way of being emotional and trying to spin the argument a little. But did I say anything untrue? I happen to think that's the way they operate.
You're next.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that we spend a little time summarizing the facts about plutonium RPGs, but I don't think we really have time for that anyway. But I'd be happy to do 5 minutes on it.
I think there's, all that information is in Luke Friedman's handout.
Yeah, pretty much it is. It's
And we have-
the other thing.
I don't want to write to the next program because selfishly I'm moderating the next program in this room. Stay on
Another
schedule
question.
if we can.
The other question I have, I guess there's one sentence that says, in the form that it appears in these RPGs, this plutonium is astoundingly benign.
Yes, plutonium oxide is not metallic.
It is the nicest
And you cannot
highly
take it.
radioactive thing you could ever imagine.
I spent a lot of time talking to this person who's not going to say, I don't care what else you do, please make this point. And I pointed out the differential toxicity between metallic plutonium, which is only found in weapons and weapons reactors, and plutonium oxide, and it didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, in fact, in that videotape on CNN, this is the argument I used, the little soundbite, was plutonium you've been talking about plutonium. Well, plutonium is nasty stuff. This is plutonium dioxide. And you may think that's a trivial point, but plutonium dioxide is as different from plutonium as sodium, a very nasty, horribly toxic metal is, from sodium chloride, which is table salt. It's a great argument.
Or bismuth subsalicylate, which is in Pepto-Bismol, is a harmless form of bismuth, which is a very toxic metal. I want to take two more, and then it's
Well, I have a question.
Oh, well, I thought that was it.
No. What? It's still not clear to me what these guys get out of it or why they picked on poor old NASA. That is, they are peace groups, they are, and they're anti-nuclear, and it's not clear what this does to further their cause. It doesn't
Here, I'll answer you, if I might.
So, if you elaborate on that.
Because this came out in discussion with Sinkin before the program and after the program. He is utterly and thoroughly and genuinely convinced that NASA is merely an adjunct of the Defense Department, and specifically the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization, and that the whole issue of RTGs is in order to allow and enable nuclear weaponry and Star Wars weaponry to be put in space. So NASA is evil. It is just part of the military. That's the real position of these people, and it's we may think that's kind of nutty, but you can't. They believe it. It is genuinely their thorough belief, and from their point of view, they're good guys trying to save things. That evil NASA is going to go do something.
You've been waiting, this gentleman back here has been waiting very patiently.
Yeah, I work out at the Space Center in Florida, and when Galileo was going up and there was all the RTG resistance and everything, I happened to read a brochure on the design of the RTG and the safety features involved in protecting it. was thoroughly amazed as to what I saw in there. It's like you couldn't get radiated from this stuff if you cut the canister open, and if you could cut it open, and broke the stuff up in the containers that are inside.
To their credit,
And
CBS
you almost
did
had
that
to
very
eat the
well.
stuff and make sure it's
No,
stayed in your
it
body.
doesn't hurt you if you eat it. Look it up.
Yeah. Well,
It's
the
not
point,
soluble.
okay, well, I don't want to make an argument with you right now. The point I wanted to bring out, because we're out of time, is that the safety features in the design are so clear that if people just understood those facts, they wouldn't have any concern about it. And I think we need to disseminate that information, which isn't classified or anything like that. And I think that would be a significant piece of information to educate the public so that they don't, just say nuclear is.
Absolutely no
Terrible.
question. Real
That's all I have to say.
final quick comment, not trying to cut you off, which is NSS may or may not, as an organization, decide to counter-demonstrate. Space Frontier Society, by God, is going to counter-demonstrate both in Florida and probably also in D.C. in front of the Rifkin's headquarters there, and also possibly the Christie Institute's headquarters there. The only determination as to whether we do either or both will be tactical. How much press can we get? We are going to do it. If NSS does it, we will do it in concert with NSS helping them. Glenn and I have discussed this. I would hope that NSS would. If it doesn't, come talk to me, because we, by God, are going to.
Jeff, unless I had forgotten your call, you had your hand up earlier.
Sorry.
This is truly the end.
Forget NSS, forget SFS. The fact is that everyone here is a knowledgeable citizen and is perfectly capable of writing their own letter to the media or calling their own television station saying, this is wrong and this is what's right.
Jeff is right.
No better note on which to end. Thank you very much, and take it to heart.